like to introduce to you Lori Lorenz. I met you a year and what, 2 years ago? Year and a half.
Oh my, 3.5 years at least.
A little closer to you, I think.
3.5 years at least.
Has it been that long?
Oh yes.
Oh my.
More than.
In Oregon. I was giving a workshop in Oregon and met Lori. And since then, she's been one of the more talented people that I've recognized, you know, with EFT and the whole tapping procedures. And I have referred to her a number of very, very complicated cases over time. And she has handled most of them extraordinarily well, by telephone, by the way. People will call from various places in the country, and she handles it by telephone. You know, does a remarkable job. And she specializes in sexual trauma, sexual abuse. You have a little history in that yourself, do you not?
Yes, I walked that road.
And I understand you're going to share that with us, so fire away.
Well, I guess one of the questions that we thought might come up is why on earth would anyone work in this area? And
it's a real fun area, right?
Yeah. And for many therapists, it's a high burnout area also. And I find that there's a high percentage of people who work in this field who have also walked this road. And I find that true with a lot of specialties, that people in drug and alcohol abuse have also recovered, and they know what happens in that. And that's often very true in sexual abuse as well. And I walked this road, and I did my healing. Can't hear? Okay. So I walked this road, and I did my healing the long, slow way. And there are many people who feel that a really complete healing is highly unlikely, and I differ with that. I really feel that deep healing and way beyond that is not only possible, but very, very probable, especially when using the techniques we have now. And EFT I have found to be extraordinary.
Let me ask you, what do you mean by, forgot the deep healing? I mean, the fact that you can get it done now. How do you know it's done completely? That wasn't your term, but I'm going to use it.
Okay. When one can speak easily of what has occurred with no triggering,
like
no
it was
response,
a walk around the block?
Like it was a walk around the block?
Something else that just happened to happen?
Just something else that just happened to happen, that is all the way down to body triggering doesn't occur, that the effects in normal, healthy sexuality are no longer there. There are certain things that can remain that many people say, well, you just deal with it, you live with it, you learn not to be so triggered by it. Things that are touch or look or certain situations that can trigger. When those no longer trigger, there's just simply no body response in the old way. It's clear.
Sure. But anyway, you were going to tell about. Are you done with your story, or?
Well,
I interrupted
do
you
we want the story?
You will. It's your story.
My own story is that I was molested at about 8.5 years old by a neighbor who was actually an adolescent himself, who was part of a stable of a fixated pedophile. A fixated pedophile is the sort who is a predator, and they are fixated on children. And they will, certain of them will develop what they call a stable and have children coming and going and teach them and have them go out and get other children. And it sort of spreads the effect. And I happened to be caught up by one of those, and it was full blown. You name it, and it happened. And in those days, there was no way to speak of it. There was no place to say it, and I had all the normal things of feeling guilty, and the way a.
You mean the social environment was not there to say it? Is that what you mean?
No one spoke of it.
Okay.
And there's a certain knowing. It's both transmitted by a pedophile, by the offender, and it was in those days. This was in the 50s, and it was resonated by the environment. I mean, where do you turn? Where do you speak of such a thing? And as a child, you know there's something wrong with this, with the secrecy and just the whole environment of it is conveyed. And there doesn't even have to be threats.
It's your big guilty secret.
The big guilty secret.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. What we were talking about this earlier, but what percent? Who knows for sure what the percent prevalence is? But you have some thoughts on that. So.
I've heard a whole range of numbers. They range anywhere from the very conservative of 25% to over 90% of females, and we have very few numbers on males, but of females by the age of 18 have had unwanted sexual advances of some sort. Mm-hmm. And it depends upon the definition. Some people say that only penetration counts, and for others it'll go as far as unwanted energy and looks and that kind of pressure, which
Sure.
is still an invasion and puts a pressure on a child.
Yeah, I'm curious, how many of you here have either deal with it personally or you have clients who deal with it, so you're interfaced with sexual abuse? Oh, look at that. Oh, you're going to have a number of questions, I think, before the day is over.
I think so.
Lori would like, I talked to her earlier, she has a number of things to cover, and I'm going to get off the stage here in a second. But a number of things to cover, but like the way I do it, she'd like to do it conversationally, because you're the ones who are going to have the questions and so on. Did I say it right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to leave you, and you are all in very good hands, okay? And we'll see you a little bit later.
Okay. So we have a lot of familiarity here, and I would guess that there's a reasonable number of people who have had first-hand experience as well. And some of this material, I hope it's not triggering. If it is, you can come and talk to me. We're all here, at least have reasonable skill in this wonderful technique. And please feel free to come and talk with me if any of this does get triggering. But one of the things I wanted to address at first is a lot of people think that this high prevalency of sexual abuse is something that's on the increase, that it's developed, it's new, and I don't find that. It goes back generation after generation, perhaps thousands of years, but it's the secrecy that has kept it hidden, that has allowed it to continue. And I really believe, I really feel in my heart that what is happening now that feels distressing to many people to have to acknowledge is actually a tremendous step in healing not only of our culture but of our planet. That, okay, that, all right, all right.
It was a little light over here.
Okay. So really what I feel that's happening is the healing process, that we can't heal until we know what's occurred, until we can speak of it. My little saying is, you can't fix what you can't see. And if you can't bring it out, if you can't be heard, if you can't speak of it to people and be supported, then how can it heal? It's going to be perpetuated. And then unconsciously, those who have been abused end up pairing so often with abusers. And it continues to occur, and the pattern gets repeated. And unconsciously, there are those who say that it's trying to work it out through repeating the pattern. For others, it's the familiarity, the feeling of self-worth, that you couldn't have a relationship any better than the type that you had, that the self-esteem, the self-worth has been so damaged. How could you stand and hold for a quality relationship when you're such damaged goods? And this coming out into the open, to me, is a celebration. As traumatic as it seems to our culture to say that this is coming out of the woodwork, how could we have such a depraved society? This is something to celebrate. So all of you out there who are working with this, I celebrate you. This is the work that is helping turn this culture around, turn people around. The next generations have the hope. And should it continue to occur, they have the support, they have the ears of us to do this healing. So I applaud you. So, a couple of questions came up here that I wanted to address first, and one person spoke to me, a gentleman, of his clients, that he felt bad that they weren't healing rapidly, and he wondered what he was doing. And there's a real issue of being gentle in this work. We have so many one-minute wonders with EFT that there's a tendency to, certainly I have, to get a little spoiled and to want things to happen really quickly. And with phobias and a lot of other issues, we can get really quick results. And there's a little more patience needed with this area. And but still, I find that what used to take this long with the old way of working through and suffering through abreaction and the like, now takes this long. And I've had a client recently who had ranked up there among the highest of type of abuse, actually from birth into mid-teens, with physical, emotional, sexual use of drugs and objects and anything you can think of. Intentional, if these people weren't skilled, if this family wasn't skilled in brainwashing, I don't know who was. And this woman cleared and is now living in joy and helping other people in 10 months. And this was an individual who was really willing to work hard. And when she was on the floor, under the table, she was there tapping like crazy. But she was willing to do it. And the results are incredible, just incredible. And there are others who have different temperaments, and maybe not even as severe of an abuse, that you really need to work slowly and carefully and patiently and with your heart and let them guide it. And really the expert in the room as to how fast this work needs to go is the one who's sitting in the chair opposite you. And if you're willing just to be patient and let them show and just invite, and I find that mapping the process of healing for them kind of takes the edge off some of the surprises that come up. That it can be beautiful work. I can do 10 hours of this work in a day and come out high. Whereas the old style of working, before we had EFT, and I worked with EMDR before this, but EFT, I still use EMDR in a certain fashion, but my main processing is EFT, hands down. Now it's work that's just beautiful, it's nourishing. And I think the more we can get the word out on this, the less burnout there will be among people who work in this healing area. So I have an outline there with a lot of information, but I'd rather open it up for people who want to ask questions and talk, and I'm sure a lot of this material will come out. So if we have anyone who wants to open with it. Okay.
Hi, Lori.
Hi.
I have a real technical question.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with a client who can't tap because anything that's around her face triggers just hysterics?
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
the only place she can tap is right here.
Mm-hmm.
She can't even do under her arm.
Okay. If this is the only place she can tap, that's where I'd start. And I would start there with the fear of having anything come at her, and with that fear of having anyone near her. And if you can, with gentleness, say, I forgive myself for having this. And a lot of self-forgiveness for having the symptoms and reactions can be very beautiful for them.
In working with some of my clients who've been abused, one of the trickiest parts is the conflicting feelings where they hated it and they liked it.
Yes.
They were singled out as the special one.
Yes.
Sometimes it felt good and how dreadful that was.
Yes.
So do you have anything to say about the
Lots.
conflict?
Lots.
Good.
This is one of the major areas I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
And what I call this is where love and abuse gets tangled up. It gets confused and actually fused. And the separating of these two elements is very important. Often, especially in a family situation, which I suspect you're referring to, the child who is singled out becomes the favored one, and they get the gifts and they get the attention. And there's a fusing of this receiving love, and the abuse is the price of it. And our bodies are hardwired from birth for sexual stimulation to be pleasurable. And that's just the way our bodies are wired. That's not good, it's not bad. It's simply the way it is. The problem is when it gets tangled up with situations that are inappropriate, when it gets stimulated too early, when it's combined with shame and guilt and fear and separation. Because even the child who's favored in the family, if there are siblings, they're going to be ostracized from those siblings. There's going to be jealousy. Often that child is parentified. They end up playing a role for the offender that is an adult role that they're not prepared to play. So there's a conflict in that as well, with feeling inadequate to the job and feeling in some odd way superior, both to the person who's offending them, and it depends too upon whether there's violence in that or not. But often the situation I think you're referring to is probably not. Sorry. This fusing of love and abuse becomes very difficult for the individual because it happens often at such an early age and at such a body level that there's almost an automatic triggering. It's happening at a really unconscious level. And the guilt that arises is guilt both for the body pleasure, which is natural and normal. And this is the kind of thing that I would explain to someone. Say, this is completely natural and normal. And there is, even though we can say it, there's nothing to feel guilty about. The guilt is still there. But the guilt is there because of this fusing. And so this mapping is very helpful. But the child doesn't understand that at the time. And so the child, with both boys and girls, can feel a sense of betrayal by the body, because the body is responding in a way that they're not in control of. So at the same time they're feeling bad about what's happening, their body is coming up with these pleasurable feelings. And they don't know how to stop the feeling. And the feeling feels good. And it's overlaid with all of that guilt and shame and secrecy. And often enough with younger children, there's pain with it as well. And that fusing then of the pain and the pleasure is something that can carry through. And it goes underground. And often what we'll find is that people will repeat that same pattern in relationships. And they say, why? Every time this relationship seems to start out wonderful, and he or she is the love of my life, and then things start to change. What didn't I see? Why couldn't I see it? And it's this fusing that's going on underneath. And there's such a longing for love that comes with that. And the unconscious assumption that along with that comes this price. And because I'm damaged goods, I can't hold out for anything better. I can't demand that I have a relationship of quality. I can't say no. Because always when love was given, it had this tail ender, speaking of tail enders, that included pain and shame and guilt and fear. Does that help?
When you start out, do you lay the foundation on how you're going to proceed with the technique, or how do you do it? I mean, when I start out, I just start kind of get a underlying what's there, and then we start addressing the fear of going there. But how do you lay out before you start? I mean, map it out. I mean, how do you map it out? What, exactly your whole procedure, or
Okay, I may not map the whole thing. I may map just a ways ahead, and depending upon where a person is, I may map further for them. But a person can feel a little overwhelmed if they get the whole thing. Other than I may speak of the fact that they can feel joy. They can be free of this. It is possible. And many of the people I work with have, they seem to either come with no prior work or they've done an awful lot and it hasn't gotten them very far. But my first work with them is I listen a lot. And it's so important to build a safe environment.
Go slow.
Yes, to go slow. Because the experience of molest, incest, of sexual abuse of any sort is one of invasion. It's one of being made to do something without one's consent. And for women, it's been often, not always, but often at the hands of men. And so there's an overcompliance often, and especially when I speak to men of working with women, it's especially important to be very patient and to tell them, I'm going to let you lead on this. And it may not have been your experience before. But it's really important that you feel safe here to choose what it is you work on and to build that safe environment. And when I work with people, and I work with both men and women, and I've worked with perpetrators as well, I really let them speak as much as they want. And I'll ask questions about it, or I'll acknowledge, or I'll say a little bit more about, well, did it also feel that way? And when they begin to realize, yeah, I understand that those are the kinds of feelings that can come up, and that's okay. You know, I let them know that that's okay that that happened. That's natural that it happened. I kind of normalize the body responses. It starts to build that safety for them. And I really watch for that safety. And then I'll explain EFT. And I have sort of my own little spiel on it that I give and relate it to the body. And we were talking about bridging, and bridging to this really out there, woo-woo kind of therapy with something that's known. And most people who have been abused have a felt sense of what it is to have something come up out of the body, to have triggers, to have body reactions that are surprising. So they get it when you say, well, these memories are in the body, these experiences are stored there. And we can talk about it till doomsday, but until we come back to where the experience occurred and clear it in the body, then the healing isn't complete. And I find after I've talked for a while about EFT and how it works with the energy and the flow of energy and the static that happens when the triggering occurs, they get it. And they go, oh yeah, okay. And most 90–95% of the time people tap on themselves, and very seldom do I ever tap on someone else, and I always ask permission. And the only times I ever do is if someone's in abreaction, they've frozen up, and then I'll tap for them.
I've had many clients who come to me and say, well, I don't know if I was, but I feel like I was. And so one of the things that I do is, do you know somebody who was, and what are your feelings about it? And usually if you address their feelings about the other person, sometimes it heals their own. And one of the reasons why I even got into EFT is because dealing with my wife's issues. And there's so many triggers or so many aspects that's so spread through, you know, it's almost impossible to get it in 1 hour, which, you know.
Yes.
And oftentimes the fear of going there, so we always walk around the perimeters and start cleaning up before we go into it and addressing the fear of going there.
By going around the perimeter before you even address the fear of going in, what do you mean?
Well, you know, we address the family issues around it, or emotions dealing with men, or the emotions of addressing the issue, because you can sense or you can feel when you get close to that big issue. And so we start walking around, so we don't have to go there now. Let's just kind of clean up some other things that you're conscious or aware of before you go into the deeper part, because, you know, it's kind of like opening the Pandora's box. You know, you got to finish up, or else it gets bigger, you know.
I will often address, go in and say, what if it were true? Maybe it's not, and we have no agenda here. And there are other events in life that can cause a fear of men or reactions to men or to various situations that can, and things that can cause triggers. And it may not be abuse. And if it were, what would that mean for you? And for many, it can mean, well, now there's something wrong with me, and now I'm damaged goods, or now I have to be a victim. I have to be labeled. And so I'll go in and I'll work with that first, and I'll say it's really not so important whether or not it really happened, but the issue that's bothering you is what's important. And maybe if we work with a fear of it first and ferret out what those reasons may be, then we can say, well, if we, for a moment, postulate that maybe it happened, and maybe it didn't, let's see. And if the tapping works or opens something, then maybe it did happen. Maybe some memory will come up, and maybe it won't. Maybe what really happened will come up. And maybe it was someone who recounted something, or a movie, or it was something not actually happening, but you felt the energy, or it was happening in your family, or it was in your friend's family, or whatever it was. I find there's a fairly high percentage that if someone thinks it happened, it did.
Probably did. Oh, yeah. One of the things from my beginning when I first started, I didn't know to address fears, all the fear of going there, or fear of knowing, or the fear of whatever. And I'd just go in gung-ho because I knew we can clean it up. And then after the first session, never addressing the fears, they don't come back.
That's right, because they were re-traumatized.
Yeah. So, you know, the thing is going slow, and like you were saying, walk around the perimeters, address how they feel about their self and their body and the others, you know, or events. And then eventually it'll just open up, and they trust you, and they realize that it doesn't have to be there. They can see the track work. They say, see, it worked there, and it can work here also.
Yes.
So.
And in the mapping I was talking about, I'll speak to them that we probably won't clear this all in one session, and there are going to be other factors, because this happens at an early age, and it's a big event. Okay, and for some it's happened over most of their childhood, and for some maybe it was only a brief event, but it can be one of those events that just changes the direction of life. And then the perception of life after that is flavored by this background thing, this big dark secret, and the whole view of the world gets shifted. And so I let them know that, okay, what may happen when we're working on a particular area is that you may suddenly become aware of a number of them, and speak those as we go. And we'll hold them aside. We don't have to clear them all at once, but please say them. And then we know what we're going to be dealing with. And they don't all have to come at you at once, because we can even use EFT to control how quickly it goes. It's like, even though I'm afraid it's all going to come at me at once, even though I'm afraid I'm going to be overwhelmed. And even that fear can build the impact when we do get into some of these issues. So if we address that fear of being overwhelmed, it's amazing how much that can diminish even the intensity when it does get there. And when we know it's going to be a strong one, I'll use the tearless trauma technique very readily. If you're familiar with that one, is everyone here familiar with? The tearless trauma technique is one where we'll refer to the event, and we'll be very general in it. We'll just refer to that event, or what happened. And I'm very clear, and I remind them continually, I don't want you to go and experience it. We're just going to refer to that thing over there. And even though that thing happened, I deeply and completely accept myself. And if I can get them to do it, I love and accept myself. And there's a lot that can come down in the reactivity if we can do that. And there's a certain safety. there's a really important skill that they can build with that's serendipitous, and that is they can begin to get some control over abreaction. And they can get some way of holding that flood of emotion at bay. And that is powerful. For someone who has lived their lives in fear of the next trigger and has tried to structure their lives not to get triggered and has hidden from that, to begin to experience the fact that, wow, I can hold it back. I have some choice in how much of this arises now. And at the end of a session, I have a choice that I can let that go quiet. And I have made a pact with myself that I will come back with it. It doesn't have to overwhelm me to keep getting my attention to heal this. That I'm now trusting myself to come and heal it. This is powerful. And this begins to affect all sorts of areas in their lives where they felt powerless.
I might suggest, Lori, that for those who are not familiar with the tearless trauma technique, it's written up in some detail on our website. There's some articles there. It's also demonstrated on one of our tape sets for those who haven't seen it.
I highly recommend the tearless trauma technique as a way to safeguard your clients and to give them a sense of power over their own internal experience, where the intrusion, the powerlessness they experienced as a child has continued through life. And I use it frequently, especially when people come in and they're fresh and raw.
Yes, I understand you work with perpetrators too?
Yes, I have. I haven't recently, but...
Can you elaborate a little bit about what you do with them? Because it's a very challenging population to work with.
Very challenging, yes. Well, I have to give you a little of the definitions then in that population, because I mentioned fixated pedophiles. Well, there's sort of a continuum among perpetrators, and there's at one end of the continuum is the fixated pedophile, and fixated means in a way their system is basically fixated on children. Heterosexual people, their natural arousal is by a member of the opposite sex. Homosexual people, their natural arousal is same gender. But a person of one orientation or the other can't suddenly say, well, okay, now I'm going to be aroused by the other person. It's like a physiological response. And it may be biological, there may be a time period in sexual development, in adolescence, or perhaps actually I think quite earlier in the development of the brain for some of the research I was involved in a long time ago, where there's a threshold set. And if anyone's ever worked with fetishes, they seem to have a threshold time of exposure and it gets set. And it's like it's a body thing, it has a mind of its own. Well, apparently with fixated pedophiles, there's an event at some critical period in their development, and it's like the system gets set. And often what I've found with fixated is that they molest themselves at the age that they are then attracted to. And working with them is very difficult. It's more a containment. It's like if you are attracted to men, you can say, okay, now I'm not going to like men anymore, and or I'm not going to like women. So that's really difficult because you're trying to buck your own system, and that takes a lot of continuous work. The other end of the continuum is regressed, and regressed pedophiles fixated generally also have a very difficult time having adult relationships. And they may, if it's a male, and it's more often males, unfortunately, they may marry a woman, but they'll marry her to get to her children. Or they'll marry a woman to have children. And at the other end, the regressed, they're emotionally immature. But they can have relationships. They can have, for the most part, a relatively normal relationship. But when they're stressed, and they often have been, I have not found any who weren't molested or abused in some fashion, fairly seriously abused. When they are severely stressed, they will regress in age, and they will, in a sense, become a child. and then they will be relating to children as a peer. But then there's this deal going on where they also have the power of an adult. So they'll relate to the child sexually as child to child and pull rank then to have power over the child. And that often happens in incestuous situations. They do not tend to be predatory, and it tends to be fewer children they molest. And they have a much better chance of healing and of becoming safe. But the big issue with any is to get to the point to where they can understand through their own experience what their victim has experienced. Most of these people who offend, men and women, have been injured themselves, have been molested, and often other kinds of abuse as well. And their own wounding is very deep, and it's very guarded and protected. They're in denial of it. They're in a highly dissociated state when they perpetrate, and so they have no connection with the experience of their victim. And the work with them is to bring them to their own pain. And if you can bring them to that, and with an interesting blend of real strong boundaries with them and compassion at the same time, and let them come to their own healing, then they can make the bridge to understanding what they have done to their victim. And it's actually a very tricky stage in the work with the perpetrator, because when they begin to realize, after having experienced their own pain, what they have done to another child, you have a high danger of suicide. And so if you're working with any offenders, that's a time you really want to watch them and stay really close to them. But I've had some do some very deep and very beautiful work, and I worked with them in groups as well. And many of them, when they finally let go, it's very beautiful work. But I'll tell you, my first experience with them was my first night at this clinic that I did my traineeship and internship with. And little newbie, wet behind the ears, walking into this clinic. I took it as my first traineeship, too. And I walked into this room, into the room where I was going to do the group work. I had to walk through this large room, and I walked in, and there were 40 sexual offenders in that room. And I kid you not, it was like being hit with a cattle prod, and it took everything I had to walk through that room. And by the end of that evening, I could see them as people, and feel for them, and see the realness of them. And it was incredible work to work at that clinic.
Lori, I'm a body worker and also an EFT. You'll have to excuse me. This is a little hard. I'm also a survivor, and I did my work the hard way, too. Yes. Tooth and nail and bruises. One thing I'd like to comment for those who are practitioners who have had these experiences themselves, I encourage you to share your experiences if you feel comfortable with your clients, because that builds an almost immediate bond of trust. Yes. It takes someone to know the other. Those of us who've been there, we have phenomenal, or as Gary would say, awesome radar. You know before you even speak your first words where this person has been. And I have found that sharing that, whether I was a body worker and knew this person had been abused, knew that there was a good chance of emotional release on the table. I should have bought stock in Kleenex about 10 years ago. But with the EFT, it takes so much of the pain away. Another bonus as a practitioner, whether you're working on this issue or any issue, always tap with the client. Because I thought I was healed, and then I found out as I was working with abuse victims with the EFT, I wasn't. And with working with them and giving them the freedom to grow and heal, it expanded my healing in ways that I never even fathomed. And a second issue is forgiveness. So many people think to forgive is to condone and then to forget. And that's my hardest barrier to help people with, is helping them to understand forgiveness is not condoning. And you don't even have to like the person. You just have to understand that they were, my sexual perpetrator was my stepfather, and he was, I suspect, very seriously abused. Now, to this day, if he were alive, I couldn't spend more than 15 minutes in the room with him. But I can understand him and I can forgive him. And that is one of the major steps in the healing that I found in the process, is learning all you have to do is understand. And that's all forgiveness is about. And learning to forgive ourselves as well.
I find this whole issue to be a very important one, and one that, as you said, is very often misunderstood. The word forgiveness is heavily laden, and unfortunately for many, they do feel that it means they must say that it's okay that this happened, and it is never okay that sexual abuse occurred. It is never okay, and no one ever has to come to that place. The term that I use more often is the word release. And releasing is allowing us to release the after effect of the experience, to release the pain and the rage and the body reactions and the attachment that occurs by the connection through that anger and that hurt and that wanting to make it okay, that bond actually that occurs with the perpetrator. It's not a wanted bonding, but it's there. And this releasing is a way to not only release the reactions and effects within ourselves, but is to release that person so that we're no longer like energetically connected to them. And I find that that often is received much better. And I explain this connotation that often comes from a religious sort of thing that you have to, it's a misunderstanding of turning the other cheek, I think. That when you forgive, that it says it's okay and, oh, it's all right, nothing has to happen to you. Well, if there's a perpetrator out there, that behavior needs containment. And if they're not willing to get treatment and to stop it themselves, then that needs containment. It needs to be addressed. Children need protection. And we can't just say that it's okay that they continue. So it's a sticky issue for some people. So I'll kind of feel out what that means, and I'll share my understanding of both words with people and let them choose what it is they want to use. I tend to use the word forgiveness more with self, because there's so much self-blame that goes on that it becomes assumed that I had something to do with it, that if I had pleasure with it, or if I couldn't stop it, or if I didn't stop it, or if I did report it and the family blew up and Dad went to prison and we were on welfare. There's so much responsibility that children take. That's where I use the word forgiveness a great deal.
Thank you. I'm presently seeing two women who have been very severely abused, both of them by both parents at an early age. And there are two different issues, one with each of them, that concern me. Well, the first one has certainly a way of avoiding dropping into the pain. She just dissociates. She just isn't present. And so that works well for her, and she's developed a technique, but it means that she's not available to experience anything. Both of these women are fairly new as clients, and we've been doing perimeter stuff, but this seems like a difficult kind of tension to work with her dissociation. You can speak to that.
Yeah. Dissociation seems to be a hardwired self-protective mechanism. And I think we all dissociate to some degree over a continuum, from just sweet daydreaming in school because you're bored to tears to dissociative identity disorder, MPD. And then we've got everything in between. The dissociation is very important, and I would not want to take that away from her too soon. And I would want to let her know that, is she aware that she's dissociating?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Very much so.
That's important, because some people are not even aware yet. So there's a process of helping them discover what's happening. But if she's aware of it, then there's, to begin with, there's the honoring of the process of dissociation, because that's her coping strategy. And you don't want to pull that away from her too soon, and let her know you don't want to do that, so that she can feel that safety, that you're not going to rip her and leave her raw to walk around the streets. But then you can begin addressing the fear of feeling the feelings and the fear that is overwhelming. And again, this is where the tearless trauma technique can be wonderful. And there can be the, even though I don't want to feel it, and I don't have to feel it now, I can begin referring to that event. And say, even though that event happened and I'm not going to feel it now, and let her build that safety. And what's happening is you're beginning to bridge to another coping strategy. And one where she can begin to experience her life and be able to trust herself to protect herself.
The other one was severely molested and abused and done to clear through high school. Her parents were also involved in some very strange religious cult, and then they left it. And evidently, her parents have always continued to act as if everything was normal. Nobody has ever referred to any of this. She's now in her late 20s, and she can't bear to be with these parents, and she's always trying to, her brother has moved to Tasmania, and she tries everything to keep her mother from visiting and avoid going to France with them. But at the same time, because she lost her childhood, because she lost her, all these things, she can't bear to lose her illusion of having a family. And so she can't quite be real with all the mix of feelings and reality about who they are, what they have done, and how she can relate to them. There's no forgiveness or dealing with even internally. It's just kind of a pretending and keeping this illusion. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that?
It sounds like it's very, there's a longing that we all have. And this also, much of the research has shown, is hardwired from birth to bond with our caretakers. This is a part of the survival instinct. And we used to think that it was the mother or the caretaker who elicited bonding with the infant. Right out of the chute, that infant is looking to get eye contact. And this is a very, very strong survival-driven instinct. And it's not one you want to get rid of, but in a way find a way to have it met. And that's the way I've found for these unmet needs to lose their power, is when they are finally met in some way. And the real way they're met is internally, rather than creating. But it can be facilitated if she has some surrogate family that may help. But what I would address in that is her fear, her longing for family, her longing for a normal family, and help her understand the normality of that, the healthiness of that, and that it may be that her family simply wasn't what she needed. And to begin addressing that and say, even though my family didn't give me what I needed, even though I longed for a normal family. Even though I'm afraid to admit that my family wasn't healthy. And cult work, I've done some with that, and religions that came about as close as you can get to qualifying as a true cult. I had one man I worked with, it took a year for him, the convoluted thinking processes about what was real and what was not, what perceptions were real, what was an illusion. They've taken a lot of what were spiritual teachings and put them in a very concrete way. It took a year for him to begin to even trust his own thinking, his own mind. And then to gradually work with his dealing with family. But I would look first to her longing and address that and let her become aware of what's operating in herself. And do that kindly. And then, has she been able to address what the abuse was?
Yes.
Okay. So she's in conflict between the image the family had and the actual direct experience she had with the family. So you've got these two sides. What you can do is ask her to hold both these images. And this is where, especially when we've gotten stuck earlier, at an early age, because her abuse started pretty early, we get the conceptual ability becomes arrested at a pretty early stage in this sort of black and white thinking. And there's some really profound shifts that can occur when you can ask them to hold both these images. Here's this abusive family in this one hand, and here's this beautiful, loving family in the other. And I'm looking at the two of them, and they don't even fit in the same planet. And then do some EFT with, even though these two families don't mesh, even though these two families are in whole different worlds, and it can allow her to begin to come to the middle zone to where she can contain both images at the same time. Because it sounds like she's going from one to the other, okay, and then in denial of the other, unable to even relate to the other when she's in the one. This allows this bridging to occur. It'll also promote the developmental growth. And you may be very surprised what happens with her. Because there's a gentleness that happens in that too, that allows her to say, even though this is incomprehensible to me.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Did I get a card for the time? Okay. If you want to come at the first one after the break, I think we have a 10-minute break?
It's going to be 15, Laurie.
15? Yeah. Okay.
So be back at 7:55.
Okay. Hi again. Okay. Yeah, and there was also a gentleman who was at this mic who was waiting, I think. Yes.
Thank you, Laurie. My name's Ron. I need to grow a little bit more.
He grew some.
Well, the comment about forgiveness really made me think of something that I feel I ought to comment on, and that's working with different people from different cultures and societies. This holds true not only working in this area, but other areas too, that some of our words, they have other meanings. Like some people, not only do they felt forgiveness feels like it's that what the other person does is okay. Some people felt like it also meant reconciliation. And when the other party's no longer available, whether they die or whatever, then reconciliation is never going to happen. So that's why it's so important to, just like you say, let go. But I thought that was very important. It was important for me to learn and realize that working with different cultures, that you have to be very conscious of what your words mean to them and find out really what that is. Thank you.
I ask. It's very important. And if their childhood was spent in another culture, I will work with them with the words in English because I most likely don't speak their language, and then I'll ask them to do the EFT in their language, because the emotional link is in that language, and their brain is having to go through a translation to come to English. So then even if they've changed the words, because very often when I go through it, I'll also do tabbing, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, the touch and breathe. And I'll do the setup statement at each point. And I'll invite a person to change it. And I may change it. We may go through several aspects in one round. But I'll ask them to go through, and they can change it all they want in their own language. And then just, okay, fill me in at the end. What was happening for you? But I find that to be essential, because that emotional world is linked to the words. So, good point. And when you're working with people in other cultures, it's important it's a humbling experience. If you haven't done your homework or you haven't been willing to be a student of that person's culture and really honor what their traditions are and say, well, tell me what that meant for you or what it means for you. And even for English-speaking, native English-speaking, that's important. It's an honoring of that person. And that's, I find, a very important piece of the work, is to honor this being who's here in the room. This is the person who's had this profound experience. And we can relate through our own experience to what they've had, but we can't know for sure what is going on. And to create the space between us for that to be expressed, for it finally to be spoken, the very speaking of it can be tremendously healing. And then we go into the body with the EFT, and wow.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to working with lesbian survivors, and specifically in two areas that seem to come up a lot. There are a lot of lesbian survivors, and a lot of them suffer in silence because obviously this is a very politically loaded subject in the community. Sex abuse has been used to pathologize their sexuality a lot by the culture. And there's also, and many of them are very defensive about the idea of having that being scapegoated, especially among butch population, which seems to be one of the populations that's least willing to seek treatment or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So there's that issue, and also the issue of kind of the irrational fear, if you will, that many of them, after they've worked so hard to accept their sexuality, that a fear that if they work through the abuse, they will start to like men. And it'll all be undone. Mm-hmm. So could you speak to how to bridge those issues with them?
What I would address first are topics along those lines of, even though I'm afraid that if I address this, I'll be labeled, or I'll be dismissed, or that my experience will be just another statistic, or written off, that my love, my orientation, my way of life becomes irrelevant because it's just a symptom of having been abused. And all of those are dismissing comments, dismissing views, and they're dismissing of the person's individual experience. And my way of working with that is to say, your orientation is your orientation, and love is love. Who you're in love with is not the issue. And I have no desire to change that, and I consider love as a very normal experience. And in setting that framework that I have no agenda in changing them, then we can begin to address their internalized homophobia, which often that's the root of it. And living in that power down situation in the culture, that's part of the power structure that looks at what is different is less than. And I may address that as a separate issue before I even go into the abuse, to where one can feel proud to be who one is, and proud to love who you love. And then we look at the power structure of gender in this culture. And that is completely separate from sexual orientation. And when it's addressed that way, it begins to tweeze apart, again, this fusion of gender orientation with, and confusion of gender orientation with the power structure. Because heterosexual women experience a good deal of that also. And as we tweeze that apart, then a lesbian woman can understand her own sexuality and accept it at a deeper level. And as that strengthens, then dealing with those fears becomes less of an issue, and we can then go into the pain and the fear as for what it is. But it's very important to address those issues first. And they're good questions to ask. And I don't, the one about, well, no, actually I have asked those questions. If you do this healing, what do you believe will happen? And for many people, whether they're homosexual or heterosexual, there's the fear that, especially if they haven't really addressed it or admitted that they have been abused, then there's the fear that they may not be who they thought they were. And we can address questions like, even though I'm afraid I won't know who I am, even though I'm afraid I'll change so much, I won't be the same, I won't be loved, I won't be accepted. So that's working around the fear of clearing the abuse. There's a certain measure of identity that's tied up with that experience. And for either orientation, any of the orientations, it's important to address that. I work with bisexual as well. Mm-hmm.
Lori, I've got two questions for you that are sort of under the heading of what we've talked a little bit about with regard to being just very sensitive and moving very slow with clients. And the first one is, if a client is just absolutely unable to say the words, I love and accept myself deeply and completely, how do you handle a situation like that?
I won't ask a person to say they love themselves if, at least at first, if that's an issue. And it often is. And sometimes I'll say that and they won't. And I won't press that issue. I do ask them to say at least I accept myself, and they say, what if I don't believe that? And I said, it's okay, you don't have to believe it. And if it's a strong issue for them, I'll work with, even though it's impossible for me to even say I accept myself, and tap with that. And that will usually lessen it. And if not, then we may be doing some digging as to what really is it that you feel about yourself. And someone may really believe themselves to be terribly vile and not even worth being alive on this planet. And when I get someone like that, I'm working really carefully. Because if it's down that far, I'm going to be checking for suicidality as well.
Also earlier, I had asked you when you're dealing with somebody, if you're talking with them, do you actually tap in the first session? And you had told me that you actually have some 2-hour sessions with people, and so that you oftentimes do go ahead and tap. I'd also asked if when you start talking with people, it's been my experience that sometimes their SUDS level drops considerably, and you had said, well, if their SUDS level is at a 0, why would they want to? And what my question is, can you elaborate a little bit further with regard to, I think that sometimes people just get something off of their chest, and it's not necessarily a permanent, the way the tapping clears the energy, but it's just off their chest at the moment, and they really can't assign a number to it, but I suspect that it would be coming back. So how would you be non-invasive and yet still get them to bring the SUDS level back up so that it can be cleared?
So you have two questions there. The first one is, I generally do a 2-hour session. And I found all through my work that we had 45 or 50-minute sessions, and we just get into something, and they say, oh, time's up, see you next week. And then you start into your session and you're catching up and you're laying the groundwork and you just start to get into something and the work is dragged out. And quite frankly, I'd like to be as efficient as I can for people. And so I explained to them that my experience, and I first got this with EMDR because they recommended a 90-minute session. And then I found, well, a 2-hour session works so much better. And I tell them I would rather work less often and take those, if it's a financial issue, and go deeply in, do a clearing, come to conclusion, come to integration, and leave with a piece that's finished, rather than leave them hanging, having to deal with something for the week in between. I'd rather work every other week that way, or once a month, or whatever they can afford. And to me, that's far more beneficial and effective use of their and my time and money, and their money. So in that first session, my primary interest is getting history and establishing rapport and introducing them to EFT. And some people come in and they are primed and ready to go, and in 20 minutes we're off and running and we're down in after the core of things. Some people, I barely get to introduce it by the end of the session because they really need to be heard for that period of time. They need to know that someone wants to hear their story. And when I get that, I'll sit there and I'll hear that story. And I'm taking notes and I'm writing, and they know I really want to hear it. And I'll give feedback through it that begins to give perspective and begins to normalize and to educate on developmental aspects and what happens in abuse. And occasionally we won't even get to EFT, but in almost every first session I'll at least introduce it. And we may get around that does some innocuous, relatively innocuous issue, just to get a taste of it. And then I have a little handout that I give them that has a diagram and my little write-up of, dealing with my, I want that cookie, or something along those lines. Some, things they can play with, even though I want that cookie, kind of a thing. And so by the second session, then, we have pretty well mapped the areas we want to work, and we're ready to dive in. So the second one had to do with when the suds drops in conversation. And if I recall, my question to you was, I think you said you were talking with your friends, and it's very important to keep your boundaries on who you do, who are your friends and who are you working with. And if you work with your friends, to be clear as to when you're working with them and not be muddying the waters as to when you're just your buddies hanging out and they need to talk something through, or when you're going to work with them. Otherwise, you start getting an imbalance in a friendship. If it's a friend and they just talk it out and they say there's nothing left, and if you ask them, well, do you want to test it out with some EFT? You want to see if it's really a zero or not? And they say no, then I wouldn't cross that line. That's a friendship. When you're working with someone on an issue, and they've agreed to work on that, and they say it's a zero, and you have a really strong feeling that they've kind of come and there's, well, it's tolerable now, and I know there's something under there, and I don't want to touch it. You can ask questions like what occurred earlier today with, well, okay, why don't you be that age now? And if there's still material there, boy, that suds will go right up. Or you can ask, if you know something about whatever the topic is, if it's abuse, you might ask another little leading question that you know is kind of right next door to the one they were talking about, and say, how does it feel about this particular issue? And very often, then that will reopen the door. But I'm real careful about my boundaries on that. My friends are my friends, and to me it's intrusive to demand that they become a client.
Hi, my name's Alistair. I'm from Ireland. Well, my first question would be, which was not the reason why I was standing at this microphone, but it just came up right now. Should you be treating your friends? I really suspect, especially over abuse issues, I think that's a pretty dangerous boundary issue, frankly. But that's not why I'm standing here.
Oh, okay. Well, to say a little bit more on that, you're right. That is a sticky wicket. And I wouldn't do it unless you're really clear on your boundaries with that and very respectful and say, I will only go as far as you invite me to go with this. And unless we make a change in our agreement. And when you shift that agreement, then I would be really upfront about how I work and what I do. And say, if you want to work with me that way, that's great. And I've done that. And it's worked well. But the important piece is to be really clean about what you're doing and how you're doing and when you're going to do it, and not to muddy the waters with that.
And there was one final point, and I don't know where I got it from. I think it's Larry Nims using the index finger, the forgiveness finger, and I find that that really, if suds don't go down, they go down there invariably.
I find the same thing.
It's brilliant.
Yes, I find that to be very effective, and I'll go through forgiving, I forgive myself for not seeing it, I forgive myself for having been young and dumb, I forgive myself, and all the self-judgment for, I forgive myself for feeling guilty, I forgive myself for not having the capacity of an adult when I was a child, because so often as children, especially when we're parentified, we have this egocentric childhood assumption that we should be able to handle it. Our parent is expecting us to take care of their emotional needs. Why can't we? And this reframing at a later date includes a lot of forgiveness for self. And there's sort of this, we can juxtapose the assumption with the reality to kind of play up the absurdity of it. And this is where we can start to get humor into it and say, even though I couldn't manage to run the whole family when I was 3 years old, and even though I couldn't make my father the happiest man in the world when I was 2 or when I was 7, even though I couldn't be the perfect wife for Dad, and these things that come up and they go, but the absurdity catches them, and all of a sudden the whole picture can shift, and they can realize how these expectations were running them and how they were expecting those to play out in following through in other relationships. And I've had people just burst out laughing. And the humor can be a wonderful piece to it. I had one woman who had been raped repeatedly by her mother, or her father, at his place of business. He would tell her she had to get up on top of one of those big case freezers, and he would rape her on top of the freezer. And it was horrific and violent, and it was very intense abreaction when we worked. And by the end of it, the visual she got was a talking penis. And she said, she called me later and she said she drove down the freeway and there was this cartoon talking penis going up there, and she was cracking up going down the freeway. On such a horrific experience, to turn it to humor like that, there's freedom. That's freedom.